Okay, this will be the last lecture I post for the the material over Easter here. So I want to pick up right where I left off with the last one. Kennedy's assassination in the fall of 1963 happened at a time when the civil rights movement had kind of reached its crisis. You had powerful movement around the country in sympathy for civil rights. You had had the March on Washington in August of '63. Kennedy had finally come around to proposing his own civil rights bill to the Congress. The powerful opposition from it came all from the southern white congressmen and senators. And even though Kennedy proposed it in June of '63, you had the March on Washington in August of '63, he's assassinated in November of '63, Johnson takes over. Johnson, and this is Martin Luther King here, and this is Lyndon Johnson in the background. That's Johnson taking his oath of office as president on the airplane that took him back from Dallas. He was in Dallas the same day as Kennedy. When Kennedy was shot, they immediately took him from the hospital to the airport. There's Mrs. Kennedy, Jackie Onassis Kennedy, or Jackie Kennedy Onassis she would later be, but just the widow Kennedy here, put them on the plane, along with the president's body, was also on the plane, and Johnson took the oath of office on his way into Washington. Okay, so Johnson's first priority really was civil rights. He understood that the nation was at a crisis, that something had to be done. Johnson was an interesting guy. He was a kind of he was a guy who was greedy for power in many ways. He was a southern Texas boy. On the other hand, he had become a congressman and grown up politically under FDR and was a huge admirer of FDR and a huge believer in the New Deal. So, you would expect him to be a very conservative guy, and he was a very anti-communist and all of that, but he was also very had a very liberal streak when it came to social things, and he really believed, apparently, in civil rights. So, and I should also point out, in addition to everything else, he was a master schmoozer. Robert Caro, who I've mentioned before, who's doing the monumental work on Johnson, one of the volumes he publishes called Master of the Senate, because Johnson, as a senator and then as vice president, was just he was a guy who could charm and bully and persuade and coax and almost seduce people into his side. He was a master at this art of politics, as we call it. Anyway, he gets the Civil Rights Act passed. Perhaps to some degree because it was a Kennedy project and people were reluctant to sort of betray the Kennedy legacy after the man had been shot. Takes a while, but Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law in July of '64. It barred discrimination in what are called public accommodations, so theaters, lunch counters, water fountains, hotels, restaurants, in schools, and it gave the Attorney General new powers to force desegregation in schools. It outlawed discrimination in employment, and it extended the civil rights to non-discrimination, not only on the basis of color or race, but also on religion, national origin, as we call it now, and sex. So it was the Civil Rights Act actually also encompassed women's rights as well. Um, that Civil Rights Act was not just for the blacks, but it honestly was a law that was written for everybody. It encompassed every conceivable group at the time. These civil rights, though, are no good unless you have political rights. That is, right to vote. So after they passed the Civil Rights Bill, Johnson and Martin Luther King and the others then focused specifically on voting rights. We know that after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment had given black men the right to vote, and then women got the right to vote in the 20th century. But as I said to you at the time, I think, you can say that you cannot bar, the 15th Amendment says you cannot bar somebody's right to vote based on race or previous condition of servitude, meaning having been a slave. It doesn't say that you can't bar it for some other reason. And so in the South, they had come up with all kinds of cockamamie ways to keep people from voting. Literacy tests. So they would hand you a paragraph to read, like a reading test, in order for you to be able to vote. And there was a famous performance piece. You know, if you were white, you walked in, and they said, okay, well, spell cat. And if you were black, you walked in, and they would say, all right, well, spell chrysanthemum. You know, they also used poll taxes. In order to vote, you had to pay a tax at the poll. So you basically were required to pay a fee to vote. And the fee was made, it was structured in such a way that if you were poor and black, there was no way you could afford it. So even though blacks theoretically had the right to vote, the Southerners had found every way to effectively take that away from them. So after the Civil Rights Act of '64, Johnson got the Voting Rights Act of '65 passed that would bar things like literacy tests and other things to keep people from voting. The 24th Amendment, which was also passed at that time, put into the Constitution a bar specifically against poll taxes. So you have to take the Voting Rights Act of 1965 together with the 24th Amendment, and it really is what gave blacks 100 years after the Civil War. Civil War ends in 1865. It's not till 1965 that these two things, 24th Amendment and Voting Rights Act of '65, effectively give blacks the right to vote, that they can actually use that amendment. The Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Movement really highlight not just the plight of black people, but also the plight of poor people. The March on Washington in August of '63 had actually been entitled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So there was an economic background to this too. You know, poverty was an issue. And so Johnson wanted to take on poverty. Now, I want to point out here that in '64, you had a presidential election. Kennedy had been gearing up for it. Johnson is now president, and he runs for election himself in '64. Thing to note there is that you had LBJ, as he was called, Lyndon Baines Johnson, on one side, and the Republican Democratic candidate. The Republican candidate was Barry Goldwater from Arizona. There may not have been an election in American history that was more of a clear contrast. LBJ represented the revival of the New Deal, massive federal government involvement in protecting individual rights, voting rights, civil rights. He was about to launch his Great Society campaign, which would be massive federal involvement in the economy and in people's economic lives. The flip side was Barry Goldwater. We have had few people who have run for office in the history of the United States who are more conservative than Barry Goldwater. Goldwater championed the tiniest federal government that could possibly exist, maximizing first individual rights and then states' rights. He was a libertarian in many ways, believed that that government is best which governs least, the smallest government is the best, and was really ardent about his virulent anti-communism, talked about bombing the communists back into the Stone Age. I mean, he was clearly the most stridently conservative voice in the country, where LBJ was certainly one of the most liberal presidents we have ever had. So the contrast in the '64 election was really quite extraordinary. LBJ won by a large margin. This is a map of that election, which for some reason when they put this together they reversed what we usually do. In most maps the Republicans are red, the Democrats are blue. Here it's the other way around. The Republican GOP Grand Old Party is blue, Democrat is red, and this is the states' rights stuff over here, which we'll get to in a minute. And this is a map, by the way, by county. Instead of just doing by state, which is kind of broad, this is by county. So you can see that the red, which is for Johnson really had broad support right across the country. The only place where Goldwater really got strong support was in the heart of the hard South, Mississippi, Alabama, the more conservative parts of Florida up here, the more conservative parts of Georgia, South Carolina. So you had that. You had some economic conservatives out in the West here, but basically, he really got broad support. This gave Johnson the sense that he could move ahead with his own program. So he goes ahead with what we call the Great Society, the purpose of which was to, in his mind, and you can argue about whether this was realistic, unrealistic, good, bad, indifferent, but the idea of the Great Society was to end poverty and to end all discrimination in things like education and jobs. I just also want to show you this while I'm thinking of it. These are the election results. You can see the vote here. Obviously, Johnson took a big vote, but that's 61 to 38% there. 61% of the popular vote to 38% of the 39% of the popular vote. Okay, so big deal, basically 60-40. That's much more than it seems. In a presidential election in the United States, if you get 55% of the vote, that's considered a landslide. So this really is a huge landslide, and this is why LBJ thought he had a mandate for the Great Society. The book to know from the time is a book by the name of The Other America, by a guy named Michael Harrington. Harrington's thesis was that despite America's booming prosperity as a whole society, about 20% of Americans were in poverty and could not get out of it. They were sort of stuck in it because of their educational opportunities or their job opportunities. They could be good people, they could keep their noses clean, stay out of trouble with the law, work hard, work 40 hours a week, be good at their jobs, and they would still never really get out of poverty. That book, The Other America, really is what triggered LBJ to launch what he called his war on poverty. Similar to the 100 Days of FDR, I guess. The war on poverty included a whole batch of legislation that Johnson got through the Congress, backed up by that 40% vote that he got. He created the Job Corps, C-O-R-P-S, which was an opportunity for kids who had dropped out of high school for various reasons to go to these kind of camps and get training in practical vocational skills. And notice, by the way, please, very important, because they ask this sometimes in AP, the Peace Corps, that was a Kennedy program, which I'm sure you've read about in the book. Job Corps was a Johnson program. Peace Corps was about sending young kids overseas to teach and help. They had a lot of engineering type students and a lot of teacher types who would go around the world, teach English, teach math skills, and help build freshwater plumbing projects for villages and things. The idea of the Peace Corps under Kennedy was to spread American goodwill and, if you will, to be, instead of spreading democracy by force of arms, spreading it by the example of our goodness. Job Corps was a domestic program to help kids get trained for jobs and get out of poverty. Note the distinction. Johnson also started, as part of this, something we still have with us today, Head Start. You guys, I hope, have heard of or are familiar with it. This is Head Start is a free preschool program, a place where kids can go and begin. Part of the point of Head Starts was to get them ready for school. Teaching little kids is very tough, especially if they're coming into first grade, because kindergarten wasn't universal then. So if they're coming to kindergarten or first grade, having never had to sit still before or share before or have a kind of schedule, So Head Start was a way to kind of help their performance in school by giving them that atmosphere as early as possible. Again, you can argue about the effectiveness of these programs or whatever, but that's what it's about. He had a program in Appalachia, which is the mountains that run from Pennsylvania down through Georgia. You may have heard of the Appalachian Trail, a great national trailway. Appalachia is famous for its poverty. You have an awful lot of black, but also a lot of white people. These are the hillbillies that really live up in the mountain towns up there and have for generations, and really have sunken into poverty, illiteracy, and so on. So he had a special program for the Appalachian region that was a bit like the PWA under FDR, building highways, roads, and building clinics, health clinics, health centers, which did two things. First of all, it provided jobs for people, and second, it then left you with a highway that went through that area and a mini hospital that people could go and get vaccinations and treatment for their diseases and chronic problems. There were a lot of dozens of other programs involved with this. A program called Model Cities, which was a similar idea to these for urban centers, trying to rebuild the inner cities that had kind of fallen into difficulty. The Medicare and Medicaid comes out of this as well. And note the difference, even if it doesn't show up in AP, note the difference for your own personal use, because it can come in handy to know this. Medicaid is a program for the poor. It provides the poor with the opportunity for basic health care. Medicare is for the elderly. So to qualify for Medicaid, you have to be making under a certain amount of money, and if you do, it's a little bit like government health insurance. You can get free health care for yourself and your kids. For Medicare, all you have to be is over 65, and in that case, the government picks up a certain portion of your medical bills. You still usually need private health insurance, but it gives you Medicare gives you some sort of basic to start with. Notice Social Security goes back to the New Deal, but Medicare and Medicaid sort of pick up with Social Security left off. In addition to that check that you simply get from Social Security, these were also now a kind of health insurance program, particularly for the disabled and the elderly, but also now extended for the poor. I should also point out that at this time you get food stamps. Food stamps, now you get a kind of plastic card, like a credit card, but when food stamps started, you got what looked sort of like money. It wasn't dollar bills, like the green dollar bills. It had its own. Well, let me see if I can find some food stamps here. There you go. There's a the food stamps as they were originally pumped out. Food stamps, as you see, are issued by Department of Agriculture, and they are usable. You could go into the supermarket, and you still can, and buy food for yourself and your family. Again, if you are poor, not making enough money to have at least the basics of a healthy meal, you could get food stamps under Johnson's program. It was restricted on what you could buy. You couldn't spend it on, there was a list of things that were eligible. So when you went up to the cash register, if you wanted to buy this, that, and the other thing, you had to pay cash. But if you had fresh vegetables and meat and actual consumable food, you could pay in food stamps. Now, these programs were not ridiculously generous. Food stamps will pay, it's been figured out once, will pay something about 14, 15 days worth of food each month for a person. That's not a lot, so nobody's really getting rich on these things. But it was a way, again, Johnson had of trying to help people out of poverty and targeting it specifically at nutritional issues for the poor. Well, it wasn't, the Great Society was not just about serving the poor, it was also, in their monetary needs, it was also about education. And so, as part of it, you had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, of 1965, which we still live with today, and various amendments to it. And you guys actually are beneficiaries of the ESEA. Why? Because it provides billions of dollars in federal money for textbooks. So the textbooks that you get in AP US History, the ones that you don't get to keep, your religion books you get to keep. The school actually has to buy those, and then we give them to you. But your history textbook, the government will pay for. And so Hill gets a certain budget each year based on how many kids we have to buy textbooks for you. Again, it's not it's not everything. The textbook budget does not allow us to buy new textbooks in every subject for every kid in the school every year. It's much smaller than that. So that's why schools have to pick and choose, and some years some departments get, and you go for years without buying textbooks in other departments. But it was a way to provide money to schools to make sure that kids were, as far as possible, being kept up to date, particularly in poorer schools. You have to realize that public schools are paid for with tax money. So if you have a town that's wealthy, and people have big houses and high property values and high incomes, you have a lot of money for your school system. So if you guys go up to Westchester and you go to Scarsdale High School or some of these others, you'd be amazed at what the public schools look like there. I mean, they're palaces. If, on the other hand, you come from a poor county in Alabama that doesn't have much money in the first place, and so you can't tax people much to pay for your school, you're going to have a real wreck. Well, the ESEA provides textbooks across the board to somehow sort of equalize a little bit the education kids are getting. The Great Society education money also created the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, or the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, as it originally was, now National Endowment for the Humanities, which provides federal money for researchers, scholars, artists, and performers. So it's federal funding for the arts, again, in part to make them available to people. So it's not just the province of the very rich who can pay $300 for tickets to go to the opera, but the NEA is meant to help artists do their thing, and then help the public have a chance to see that art, or participate in it, or listen to it, or whatever. The last point on the Great Society program would also be the Immigration Act of 1965. The Immigration Act, as I mentioned to you, if you remember way back, the 1920s, America closed its doors. 1924, you had the National Origins Act, which basically restricted immigration to very strict quotas. Only so many immigrants were allowed legally into the country each year, and the percentage of what country they came from was based on the percentage of people that were already here. In other words, it meant that if you were coming from Germany or Ireland, you had a fairly easy time of immigrating to the United States if you really wanted to. If you were coming from an African country or a Latin American country, which in 1924 there were far fewer already here, you had a tougher time. that really ended the great era of immigration. That's why if you look at immigration in American history, you have a big surge of it, and the surge, for instance, of Italian immigration and Jewish immigration really ramps up starting in the 1880s, and then through World War I, and then into 1922, 23, and then stops. 1924, it gets choked down to a trickle because this National Origins Act in 1924 not only put in quotas, but really tightly restricted immigration altogether. In 1965, as part of Great Society, Johnson gets Congress to pass the Immigration Act of 1965. This abolished the system of national quotas. And it wasn't intended to do this, but in fact what it did was it allowed a huge wave of immigration from Asia, particularly places like the Philippines, but also other places in Asia, and from Latin America. Because once those restrictions came off, then you had a lot of people from those areas who wanted to come to America and had been sort of holding back and waiting. So that really launched an immigration, a wave of immigration of people from those countries. Note that LBJ is consciously patterning himself in many ways on FDR. It's in the New Deal and the Great Society are both about government intervention in the economy, federal government being responsible for people's social welfare and to solve social problems. They both have elements that are geared specifically toward the elderly, as we just mentioned, toward employment of people, and both of them also, we don't go into too many specifics, but encouraged housing construction, which is important because not only does that provide housing jobs, but again, supply and demand. The more housing is out there, the lower the prices are going to be because people try to get rid of it. And one of the biggest problems an economy has is keeping housing prices low. One of people's biggest expenses is rent or mortgage. Differences between New Deal and Great Society. Great Society was much more concerned with education than New Deal was. New Deal really didn't have much of an educational element. It just didn't occur to them at the time. Great Society definitely provides for Head Start with preschool education, textbook for older kids' education, and the Great Society, don't forget, gets launched with these civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation to protect the rights of blacks, but also any other minority, religious minority, minorities of national origin, immigration, and also women and sex. As we talked about, FDR ran into some difficulty, if you will, with the court, the Supreme Court, to kind of put the brakes on him now and then. Johnson really didn't. The Supreme Court, under, we talked about Chief Justice Earl Warren, tended to side with him and interpreted the Constitution expansively, expanding the powers of the federal government to involve itself, but also restricting police powers, police authority. It's under this court that you get the famous Miranda decision, for instance. That is, if you're arrested, a cop has to tell you that before he asks you a question, he has to tell you you don't have the right to lie. You never have the right to lie to a cop, but you don't have the obligation to say anything. You can remain silent. So you have the right to remain silent. But if you say something, it can be used against you. And the cop also has to tell you that you have the right to have a lawyer give you advice, and if you can't afford one, you're entitled to have a free one given by the court. the Miranda decision, which is based on a guy in Arizona who got arrested, and the cops never told him that he could keep his mouth shut. Well, you have a right under the Fifth Amendment not to incriminate yourself. You can't be forced to testify against yourself, so the court found that you have to do that. The court, that sort of thing, not just that specific decision, but that sort of thing, siding with defendants and siding with government intervention in the economy and in people's economic lives, the Warren Court went along with all of this. The Miranda versus Arizona decision, and I should also point out the Gideon decision, Gideon versus Wainwright. The Gideon decision found that you have a right to an attorney. The Miranda decision found that the cops have to inform you of that. So the idea is this: because your life or your freedom is at stake in court, you can't effectively navigate the court system without expert advice. So if you are arrested, you have the right to have a lawyer there. If you cannot afford a lawyer, you have the right to have the government provide one to you. That's not just a nice thing to do, it's a right that you have under the law. The Gideon versus Wainwright decision really, with the Miranda decision, are two of the key criminal case decisions that came out of the Supreme Court under Johnson. And what are they doing? They're both expanding defendant rights, in theory, to protect poor people. The Gideon decision is largely about the indigent, the poor. If you cannot afford an attorney, what do? You don't have to face it alone. Rich guys get lawyers, so should you. I should also point out that when it comes to voting rights, the court also tended to side with the civil rights legislation. The Supreme Court, in a case called Baker versus Carr, C-A-R-R, found that that legislative districts should be equal. It's a principle called one man, one vote. That is to say that each person has one vote. If you are represented by somebody, everybody should have a roughly equal share of that vote. So, for instance, you can't draw the lines of a congressional district so that one district has 500,000 people in it and another district has 1 million people in it. Why not? Because if I'm in one district, I own 1/500,000th of that guy's vote, but the guy in the other district owns only 1/1,000,000th of the vote, half as much as I do. Now, that's not really the way congressmen vote. They don't, you don't have everybody in the district vote, but the concept that in a legislative body, like the Congress or a state legislature or city council, each individual should be equally represented. Therefore, each district that's represented by a state senator or an assemblyman or a congressman should be equal in size as far as possible. This is what Baker v. Carr found, that if you don't do that, you're actually giving some people more influence than others, is the concept of it. Baker v. Carr, again, another important decision. I'll just give you one example of it. In New York City, we have 5 boroughs: Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Once upon a time, there was a body in the New York City government called the Board of Estimate. The Board of Estimate oversaw an awful lot of the finances of the city. They approved contracts the city made to buy large purchases, to contract with people for large construction projects, to give people approval to use city land to make money, that's what we call franchises. So the cable companies, they string their wires through the telephone poles and stuff. They're using city property in order to make money, so they have to pay the city a fee. So the Board of Estimate was actually a pretty heavy-duty body. There was a huge amount of money that passed through the Board of Estimate's hands. Well, the Board of Estimate, each borough on the Board of Estimate had an equal vote. So Staten Island's vote was the same as Brooklyn's, was the same as Queens, was the same as the Bronx, same as Manhattan. Sounds nice, right? Case in 1983, Supreme Court found that that's illegal. Why? Because at the time Staten Island had about 300,000 people and Brooklyn had 2.5 million people. And that meant the guy representing Staten Island was representing far fewer people, and therefore each person on Staten Island theoretically had a larger share of the vote. I mean, if you think of it this way, Manhattan had about 1.5 million people living in it. Staten Island had, say, 500,000 people. Together, we'd be only 2 million people, and yet our votes counted 2, Manhattan and Staten Island. Brooklyn, with 2.5 million people, their vote only counted 1. And the court found that's not fair because each person should have an equal share of the vote, and therefore one person, one vote. And so the Board of Estimate was abolished. On the other hand, New York City government also has a city council, and the city council is made up of 51 members, and each represents a district, and they simply take the city and they carve it up into districts. Each district has almost exactly the same number of people. You never get it exact, but within about 3, 4, 5%. That's okay, because a person in District 50 and a person in District 2, there's roughly the same number of people in each. The representative for those districts is representing the same number of people, so that's okay. So Baker v. Carr actually had a lot of implications for state governments across the country and city governments, because it put the weight of votes back into population. That would wind up in a lot of states pushing, now watch this, pushing votes into the cities. See, in a lot of areas, the old district lines had been drawn many years ago, and the rural areas, which tend to be more conservative and tend to be, in many states, more white, got as many votes as an urban area, which tended to have more poor people in it and more black people in it. And the Supreme Court said, no, you have to base it not on carving up the state any way you want. It has to be population-based. And then all of a sudden, all of those people who had much less of a vote in the cities suddenly became much more dominant in state politics. So something like Baker v. Carr, which may seem like some sort of technical nonsense about voting mathematics, actually has important civil rights implications. Okay. I want to talk then briefly about the as we go on from Great Society and you get into the later 60s, you begin to get a convergence of these social movements. The civil rights movement, the movement for the poor, and also, as I talked about previously, the movement against the war, and the counterculture movement that kind of grows out of those beats that we talked about from the 50s. just as the nation seemed to be divided black and white, and Johnson was trying to deal with that, the nation was also divided between hawks and doves. The hawks were pro-war people, the doves were against the war. And as the Vietnam War in the late 60s got less and less popular, and people began to protest it more, you got more strident division between hawks and doves. You also had some stridency in these various social movements we talked about. While King was pushing his strict nonviolent program, not everybody else in the black movement was doing that. As you got into the 60s, you had leaders like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, who were calling for much more militancy. Malcolm X, who came out of the Nation of Islam, although he later broke with the Nation of Islam and refused to have much to do with it. He was a Muslim himself, but he was, if you will, became an Orthodox Muslim later. But Malcolm X's idea was that he was in his own way a kind of segregationist, that whites and blacks can't really get along together, and so it's for black people to develop their own economy. And live sort of in their own separate society within America. Malcolm X, a very interesting guy, but he really believed in militancy. He didn't exactly go picking fights, but a famous quote of his, "When I say the fight for independence is right here, I don't mean any nonviolent fight or turn the other cheek fight. Those days are gone, those days are over." So he was in favor of real militancy. Malcolm X, of course, was assassinated in 1965, apparently by the leadership of the Nation of Islam that didn't like the fact that he was breaking away from them. He, in a certain way, echoes Marcus Garvey. If you look back at Garvey from the early part of the 20th century, he was also calling for a black separatism, development of the black economy on its own. If the whites won't have us, then fine, we'll do our own thing in our own way, and we'll sort of opt out of white society. Stokely Carmichael really rose to prominence after King, and he was the guy who coined the phrase black power, meaning blacks should run their own communities, elect their own black representatives from their black towns and neighborhoods, should own their own businesses. He became the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that was kind of, well, to say it's kind of unfortunate. It really changed the complexion of SNCC. SNCC had been, as I said early on, black and white kids committed to nonviolence. When Carmichael takes over SNCC, he tosses out the whites and turns it into an all-black organization, and it really becomes much more militant. The kind of extreme end of it, and Carmichael gets involved with them later, is the Black Panther Party. That was run by two guys named Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton. The Black Panther movement, which considered itself a political party, the Black Panther Party, was very militant. They actually engaged in close order drill. So they had marching and drilling that they went on. and chants that they would make, and really part of the point of the Black Panther movement was to intimidate white society. White society, you're not going to impress us because look at us, we'll fight right back. So that was a real shift that went on there. The civil rights movement at times burst into violence. King was committed to nonviolence, so was the SCLC. But in 66 and 67, you had what were called the Long Hot Summers, which were times when the frustration that black people were experiencing and frustration over poverty boiled over into riots and destruction. You had race riots in dozens of American cities, most notably Detroit. You actually had a race riot in Detroit that people burned down buildings, burned down housing projects, and there were almost 50 people killed in that riot, and thousands of people were left homeless. You had similar riots in other cities in Newark and even in parts of New York, which showed the tension that was building in America. In a way, you had a lot of things coming to a head. Frustrations over civil rights, frustrations over poverty, frustrations over the war, frustrations over conformist society left over from the 50s, were all kind of ratcheting up in 66, 67, 68, 69, into a tension that you could really feel. And lots of liberation movements, women's liberation was starting at the time, and youth. You have read at this point about the hippies and the counterculture. The counterculture was all over the place. You had the hippie movement, which is its own very complicated story. But this was mostly teenagers and college-age kids who wanted to completely change society. There was lots of involvement with drugs, which was justified as experimentation and expanding your mind. Anything that changed and expanded your consciousness would be good. Different perspective, different way of looking at things, break out of the conformity. And the phrase, of course, at the time was tune in, turn on, and drop out. Tune into the vibe, turn on to the drugs, and then drop out of society. Society makes you go to school, it makes you go to college, it makes you go have a career and have a family and live in a house in the suburbs, but we say reject all of that. Reject capitalism, reject militancy. So you live in a commune where nobody owns anything and everybody owns everything and everybody shares whatever they have, and you live close to nature and beg in the streets, and it's all about being artistic and all of this. It was a lot of kids from middle-class families who were rejecting the kind of conformity that they had seen in their parents. A lot of them were looking at their parents who seemed kind of stuck in bland, dead-end lives, in those little suburban Levittown houses, and the kids are looking at, is this what it's all about? So I'm going to reject it all and start over. And so instead of wearing business suits and neatly cropped hair and looking respectable at all times, you rebelled against that by doing the opposite. So you wore, torn up old jeans and let your hair grow long, and rejected the expectations of society. the drug experimentation, sexual experimentation. Hey, this whole thing about lifelong marriage between man and a woman. Why can't we just... Now, it sounds really good, but it turned out to be very self-destructive. The hippies inevitably wound up in like ridiculous, crushing, starving poverty, homelessness, medical difficulties of all kinds, or terribly unhappy, it's nice to talk about having a cooperative and communal economy, but when you really try to do it, you find out people really are greedy, people really are lazy. And so, these kids would go and find some old house in the country, and they'd set up a commune, and then find that nobody really wanted to do the dishes, nobody really wanted to take out the garbage, and so the garbage would pile up, and we kind of discover, hey, society has rules for a reason, and so on, which was often very disillusioning to them all. But the counterculture movement and the civil rights movement often, there was a lot of nexus between the two of them. And then it becomes the anti-war movement. So a lot of the people involved with civil rights, a lot of the people involved with the hippie counterculture and artsy movement also got involved with the anti-war protests. And as they ratcheted up and became more militant, they became almost their whole own industry. That gets us to 1968, where things really turned dark. As I mentioned in the last lecture, Johnson in 68 announces that he's not running for re-election, and that Johnson has a plan to really start pulling us out of Vietnam. We talked about that doesn't really happen. Nixon goes in another direction with it. But Johnson makes this announcement in March of 68. A few days later, Martin Luther King is shot to death. James Earl Ray, guy who just seemed to not like King. Nobody's really ever explained it. He was a white guy. Just blew away Martin Luther King when he was in Memphis. He had gone to Memphis because there was a garbage man strike. The sanitation workers, who were almost all black, were going on strike. So King had gone there to sort of support them and help them out. Stepped out of his room at the motel he was staying and was shot and killed instantly, or almost instantly. This stunned people, although after John F. Kennedy's assassination, there was a sense not just of shock, but also, my God, what the hell is the world coming to? Is this what we're going to do now, is just kill everybody we don't like? But it also represented a terrible thing in the black community. King had represented nonviolence and had been struck down violently, and there was a sense in the black community of anger and bitterness and betrayal. Here we tried to do this in the nonviolent way with this guy, and you threw it back in our face by killing him. And so people reacted to that with violence. There was a wave of riots in all the major cities of the United States after King's assassination by people who were burning their own neighborhoods, setting fire to their own neighborhoods in this sort of angry frustration. Well, the progressive types, the liberal types, having seen this happen to King, turned to Robert Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, brother of President John Kennedy, senator from New York by this time, 1968, who, as I said, is running for president himself. One of the reasons that Johnson gets out of, when Johnson gets out of the presidency, announces he's not running for re-election, Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy announced that they will run for the presidency, take the country in a different way. So Bobby is running for president, and a lot of people then turn to him as sort of, well, now this is going to be the voice of this civil rights, more just society, great society kind of view of the world, and he's our guy. All right, so King is assassinated in April. In June, so 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is also assassinated. A guy named Sirhan, who opposed Kennedy's support for Israel, as Robert Kennedy had just won the primary in California, which basically meant he was going to be the Democratic nominee for president. And he had talked to his supporters in a big ballroom in a hotel. Walks out of the ballroom in the hotel. They take him out through the kitchen, kind of out the back way, and this guy comes out of nowhere and plugs him and kills him. So there the country is, having faced Kennedy's assassination just a few years before, 1963. Now King is assassinated, and a couple of months later, the second Kennedy is assassinated. It seems, it seemed like the world was falling apart or falling into chaos. Between that and the riots that were going on, the whole world kind of seemed out of control. When the Democratic Party finally met in that summer, to choose a candidate for president, they met in Chicago, and they were going to nominate for president. Now, who's left? Eugene McCarthy was considered sort of too wacky, too hippie to actually run for president. It wasn't acceptable to all the party. Bobby Kennedy is dead. So they turned to, remember who I mentioned way back? Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey had gone from being mayor of Minneapolis to being a senator from Minnesota to being vice president. He was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. And Humphrey was a cautious left-wing kind of guy. So the Democrats are holding their convention in Chicago, and outside the convention you have this massive anti-war protest. We're now in '68. We've been through a couple of assassinations. The war in Vietnam is not going well. You have the counterculture movement ratcheting up. The civil rights movement has been going, and so you have this massive anti-war demonstration outside the Democratic Convention because this has been Johnson's war, who's a Democrat. The response to that anti-war protest was that Richard Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago, sent the Chicago police into the streets of Chicago to push away the demonstrators. Again, we are talking about events that are happening live on national TV, and the Chicago convention was a mess. Outside the convention, you had Daley's cops in riot gear on camera, literally beating the living daylights out of these teenagers who were protesting the war, and firing tear gas bombs into parks full of college kids. Inside the convention hall, you have this wild floor fight. Two different delegations to the convention showed up from California, and there was a big fight over which one was the legal delegation. And fights, and Eugene McCarthy's people were demonstrating for him, and there were people getting into fist fights on the floor of the convention. Humphrey gets the nomination on the Democratic side. And it takes him a while before he will finally commit to ending the bombing of North Vietnam and beginning to de-escalate the war there. So he has trouble getting support from his own party because he's so cautious. On the other side, you have Richard Nixon, whom I've talked about before. And I talked about in the last lecture why he was popular with people. In the middle, or I shouldn't even say in the middle, because he's not really in the middle of them politically, but in the midst of this, you have George Wallace running as a third-party candidate. You remember George Wallace, the guy I showed you in the civil rights lecture, who stood in the door of the school in Alabama to bar integration of the university there. Wallace ran on a third party with the slogan, I kid you not, here's the slogan, in 1968, quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace was an ardent segregationist, but he was also ardently opposed to the anti-war movement, the protesters, and the counterculture. You know, the hippies and the kids doing their wild thing. So a lot of middle-class Americans looked at him and said, well, here's a guy who's finally going to kick those college kids in the butt who spend all day, you know, trampling the American flag and protesting the war, and he's going to kick the hippies in the butt who do nothing all day but sit around and smoke pot and talk about art and music, and this guy kind of seems really good. So Wallace wound up splitting a lot of Democrats off who might have otherwise voted for Humphrey as the Democratic candidate, and that's really how Nixon gets elected in a very badly divided country. Okay, so that takes us then to 1970. It gets you through the material that I asked you to read over the vacation. I hope you've gotten something out of these lectures. I hope you're interacting with this material. I have forums up there for you to ask questions on. I have posted all of the essay questions from all of the AP exams back to about 2003, I think. Look at them, try them out, try to write outlines for yourself. It's a way to study. I have put a forum online that you can post. You tell us what question you're looking at, and then post a proposed thesis for the answer, and we can talk about it and critique it. But unless you're going through this material yourself, you know, you're not going to be ready for this exam. And I could have 1,000 hours of lectures and teach you AP history 8 periods a day, 5 days a week, and it's not going to help you prepare for the exam unless you're doing the thinking about it yourself and considering and reading on this stuff. And if you find any of this stuff interesting or something grabs your attention, Googling it, looking at pictures, reading up on it. Okay. We'll see you all when you get back.